Glory to Ukraine. Today is February the 9th this year. Welcome at the Military Media Center. 351 days of Ukrainian struggle against Russian aggression. Today's war is called the War of Artillery. Thanks to our partners, we have large caliber and different types of artillery and ammunition. But what artillery shells are firing at Ukrainian cities, their components, etc. Today you will be briefed about this by the representative of the Captured and Advanced Weapons and Military Equipment Research Center, Andriy Rudik. Dear guests, from the very beginning of its history, artillery has aroused fear in both those who use it and those against whom it is directed. With each successive century of human existence, artillery gained the status of the most destructive weapon. Starting in the second half of the 19th century, artillery weapons achieved not only the ability to leave no stone unturned from populated areas and cities, but also to change the natural landscape and erasing forests. On this slide, you can see some of the most telling facts about the results of the use of this type of weapon. While the first two examples relate to the number of death and destruction caused by artillery in wars of the past, the third one is the product of analysis and attempt to predict the consequences of using artillery in war of the 21st century, as an example of the North and South Korea. As a result, contrary to different predictions about the dominance of air component in the war, artillery is one of the most important factors and means in the conduct of hostilities. Unfortunately, Ukraine and our society have learned this the hard way. As you can see on this slide, there are lots of destruction, suffering, grief, and tears and of tortured population because of the use of artillery. In the end, perhaps we would not be here today at all. However, we live in a different reality in which artillery kills and destroys not only combatants in military facilities, but also civilians, their apartments, schools, farms, and hospitals. That is why humanity in the 20th and 21st centuries, guided by the experience of the 19th century, has tried several times to regulate the use of missile and artillery weapons. However, no convention, international treaty or agreement has saved tens of thousands of dead residents of Seoul, Grozny, from ballistic missiles, etc. Unfortunately, the world did not see, hear or talk about the terrorist actions of Russian artillery and missile forces in Chechnya. That is why it was followed by Georgia, Syria, and now Ukraine. Previously, we could have assumed that Russia was trying to hide its own terrorism, shift responsibility to the enemy, or pretend that nothing had happened. But today, the Kremlin is not only deliberately violating international humanitarian law in terms of the use of artillery, but is also boasting about it. It's worth recalling that Russia has undertaken obligations under the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons in terms of Protocol 3 on prohibitions or restrictions on the use of incendiary weapons. However, Russian artillery continues to shell Ukrainian cities and positions of our soldiers with phosphorus and incendiary munitions. This is a direct violation of Article 2, Paragraph 1 and 4 of the Protocol 3. And you can see the evidence and examples of this on these slides. However, Russian propagandists continue to tell how the occupiers and invaders bravely destroyed the Ukrainian military depot. However, instead of the depot, several dozens hectares of Ukrainian forest completely burned down, or another high building with its resident burned down like a candle, or someone's skin, organs, or lungs were poisoned. Russia's large-scale aggression against Ukraine has demonstrated that artillery is a means of boosting and increasing morale of their own troops. However, the high morale of Ukrainian troops, Russia is trying to compensate with artillery and rocket attacks on Ukrainian settlements and cities. And this is a direct violation of Part 4, Article 51 of Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions of the year 1949. The daily number of such attacks can reach 100 or even more cases. That is why on this slide you can see only a small part of all rocket and artillery attacks that Russian troops are methodically destroying our country with. This is one of the fundamental means of ensuring Russia's permanent terrorist act against Ukrainian society. The result of these are not only occupied and destroyed Mariupol, mangled and destroyed Nikopol, wounded Kharkiv and other cities, but also injuries and death of thousands of Ukrainians. Every day we are forced and have to tell the whole country that as a result of artillery shelling in the north, east or south of our country, a house, apartment, estate, farm was destroyed. A child, a woman in labor was killed, and grandfather, girl, a dog was injured. Our hospitals are treating not only wounded soldiers around the clock, but also performing extremely difficult surgeries, removing shrapnel from hearts, faces, and amputating the remains of limbs, removing the remains of eyes of civilian victims of Russian artillery. The most unfortunate thing is that if it were not for foreign components in the electronic equipment of artillery and missile systems, Russian troops would hardly be able to carry out such large-scale attacks against the civilian population of Ukraine. And yes, you heard it right. Almost all of the sophisticated electronics in the service of Russian artillery are imported. Our research has shown that the Russian military-industrial complex is not capable of producing anything more complex than resistors, arrays, and resonators. The slide shows one of the many examples of important foreign components in the electronics of Tornado MLRS. And I'm also holding a captured sample of the Baguette 83 onboard computer used in the Tornado G MLRS. Here you can see some chips made in the US and Switzerland. They have the appropriate serial numbers and labels. The electronic unit 14C821S on this slide does not contain any Russian things at all. All the components are of American, Southern Korean, and Swiss origin. Thanks to such small boards and circuits, the Russian artillerymen precisely direct deadly shells, not only Ukrainian military equipment, but also against civilian facilities and people. If the electronics of Russian military equipment that directly fires on Ukrainian cities are so dependent on important components, we cannot even talk about the equipment designed for automated artillery fire control. On this slide, you can see a captured 1V1003 command and surveillance vehicle, Canonada. The electronics of this vehicle is an example of the total dependence of the Russian military-industrial complex. And it's even enough to look at the computers and other computing unit, in which case they are of American, Taiwanese, Dutch, and German origin. In fact, if it were not for foreign chips and boards, this system, this complex, would simply not exist, and the Russian military would have to fire artillery as in World War II, using the paper map. You have just been shown a far from a complete list of evidence of insignificance of the Russian complex, military-industrial complex. Other examples of the so-called Russian know-how filled with foreign components can be found at the exposition you can see at this room. You can also ask questions to the representatives of our research center. The presence of such a wide variety of foreign components in Russian electronics does not mean that the sanctions policy of Western partners and Ukraine against Russia is ineffective. On the contrary, if it were not for the significant economic restrictions imposed on the Russian regime, Ukraine would have had to face many more surprises and discoveries. And we are grateful to our foreign partners for such support. However, Russia continues to receive chips, circuits, converters, and other high-tech products. In order to, if you want to finish and put an end to this war, we have to make impossible the use of Russian and foreign-made components in Russian artillery shells and other systems, because every day of hesitations equals thousands of hundreds of civilian deaths, injured people, and other terrible consequences. The high intellectual work of citizens from around the world should not be tarnished by the cynical and inhuman actions of the terrorist state. Thank you. We are grateful to our speaker for this report, and it's worth recalling that there is a mic in the hall, and you can ask questions if you want. Dear Andrei, this is Army Inform. I have a question to you. So you mentioned the fire control equipment of the Tornado system. Can you tell if the Uragan, Smerch, and Grad systems use more sophisticated equipment on the battlefield? Thank you for your question. This is not a fire control equipment, but this is the MLRS. And yes, unfortunately, it's used. And these chips and microsuits made by Russians, they are made for the purpose so it can be replaceable or dual use. So you can replace it and use in another system. And that is why we concentrated on the Tornado system. So it's worth mentioning that they are versatile and all-purpose. Do we have any other questions? Good morning, Olena Rabinska, the Fifth Channel. Can we find out the information about the production of such chips and microsuits? For example, were they produced before the 24th of February the previous year or not? And can we also determine the countries, for example, like Korea, that are supplying these chips to Russia? Thank you for your question. Actually, at our research center, we do surveys about the filling and the inside components of such circuits and chips. But the supply channels, the date is out of and beyond of our responsibility. This is, it refers to the development department, which we are consulting with, but actually it's beyond our responsibility. Do we have any other questions? Morning. Are the foreign components used in the production of artillery shells? Thank you for this question. Artillery munitions and shells, if we, for example, take a old-fashioned and obsolete. They are not filled with foreign-made components, because Russians have enough resources to make their own old-fashioned munitions. But in this report, we focused on the guidance and fire control systems, because these systems indeed contain other systems, chips, etc. Because Russians can do only like simple transistors and other chips. Thank you. Do we have other questions? This is Ukrinform, Irina Kožuchar. The Russians had covered import. Do they have enough resources to continue that? The things we survey and research, based on that, we cannot say that we received such surprises like they have been stuffed and they contained more chips or electronic circuits. But as for in terms of supply channels and suppliers, contractors, we cannot say this. But in this case, we can say that that the foreign components are indeed inside of these systems, but we don't know about suppliers. Thank you, our speaker, and we had a briefing of the representative of the Advanced and Captured Weapons and Equipment Research Center, Andriy Rudik. This is Military Media Center, the only platform of the security and defense forces. Glory to Ukraine, stand united for the victory.